fifth grade teachers. My name is Kelly, and today I'm going to walk you through the Civil Rights Unit for fifth grade social studies. This is the last main social studies unit of the year and follows the Civil War unit. There are 4 chapters, which include 19 lessons and takes about 26 days to complete, plus the summative assessment. In this unit, students are going to take a look at the struggle that various groups of people have gone through in order to obtain or protect their rights. These topics include women's suffrage, African American rights, and the civil rights movement, Native American rights, and taking a look at groups that still struggle today. Students will also learn about the methods that these groups used in order to promote civic action. You can take a look at the unit question map to see how the unit is structured. There is a slideshow that helps you move through the unit. The compelling question for this unit is it important to protect our rights? We have 4 supporting questions. Were all Americans given rights when the Constitution was created? How have people fought to gain their rights? What has the government done to protect people's rights? And do people still have to fight for their rights today? Chapter 1 lessons are called What are Civil Rights? And go along with supporting question 1. Students are going to learn about the meaning of civil rights, consider who was given rights when the Constitution was created, focusing mainly on the right to vote, and learn how rights changed for African Americans following the Civil War. Lesson 1 is the overview of civil rights. Students begin with completing a WDIS of this image of the Civil Rights March in Washington. Have students write down 3 questions they have about what is happening in the picture. Share the compelling question with students, and then take a look at paragraph 2, line 1 of the Declaration of Independence. The section of "We hold these truths to be self-evident" about the equality and the unalienable rights. Explain to students that these are the basic rights that are given to humans and citizens, and that those rights are called civil rights. Have students read the section on the civil rights overview called "What does civil rights mean?" Have students write a definition for civil rights. Lesson 2 is about voting rights background. So we do a quick reminder on the definition of civil rights and the fact that the Constitution protects these rights. Have students think back to the Constitution unit and consider what groups of people were not given these rights, perhaps because they were not noticed as citizens at that time. Then move into talking about voting rights. There are a couple of resources that you can use to help answer these questions. This is a nice visual for students to see how voting rights developed over time. Lesson 3 begins with a review of Iowa's role in the Civil War. Take a look at this paragraph from the Iowa Constitution of 1857 and see if students notice that it has a very similar sound to the paragraph from the Declaration of Independence. Point out the line, "All men are free and equal," and ask students if they think that that means African Americans were treated fairly in Iowa. Have students read about African American suffrage in the Right to Vote in Iowa worksheet to find the answer. Students get to learn about Alexander Clark and take a look at his speech, as well as what he did to try and help improve the treatment of African American citizens in Iowa. Lesson 4 is the treatment of African Americans post-Civil War. And students begin by looking at this sign from a waiting room. This helps lead into the discussion of segregation and a review of Jim Crow laws prior to having students move to the Rights WebQuest activity. Chapter 2 is called Women's Rights and focuses on supporting question 2. In this, we are learning about the different strategies people have used in order to gain rights, focusing on the women's suffrage movement to explore said strategies. Lesson 5 is the Intro to Women's Suffrage. Students will complete this anticipation activity, looking at this primary source and responding to what they see and what they wonder. Share supporting question 2 and generate a list of thoughts or questions students had when they looked at the image. Explain the image, define suffrage, and talk about whether women's suffrage occurred before or after the 15th Amendment. There's a video on Freedom Flicks that has some good background information on women's right to vote. Pass out the Strategies for Change worksheet and use the information on slide 18 to help students capture a basic definition of each. In lesson 6, we focus on the Assemble and Organize strategy of civic action. There's some information about the Seneca Falls Convention to help students understand the start of the women's suffrage movement. You could also use pages 16 through 19 of Freedom Flicks to supplement the video or to replace the video. Have students read the information on slide 20 to see what they notice. This is a paragraph from the Declaration of Sentiments, which was written in a similar style of the Declaration of Independence at the Seneca Falls Convention, adding in the key words of "and women." Lesson 7, we take a look at the increased public awareness strategy. And this time we pull it closer to more modern day campaign of Rock the Vote. Talk about how this is one way to try and get more young people to vote in elections. Share with students that this is not a new strategy and that the women of the suffrage movement did the same thing. You can access the Library of Congress collection on items and find out that things such as brochures, pamphlets, teapots, plates, all of these different things helped promote women's suffrage movement. In lesson 8, we take a look at the last two strategies of protest and lobby. With protest, we take a look at whether some of the strategies are a violent or non-violent way to protest. With lobby, we talk about the process of lobbying, which is to try and convince politicians to change a law. This is an important part because you can talk about it and hold conventions all you want, but if you don't convince the lawmakers to make the change, you're not going to see much progress. On slide 26, there is an infographic from iCivics about the two main approaches used to gain suffrage for women. We had the state-by-state approach, which was to try and get the right to vote passed in every state. And we had the federal approach, which was to try to get the federal government to amend the Constitution and say that all women had the right to vote. Carrie Chapman Catt is the Iowa connection. She's someone that helped get the 19th Amendment passed. Chapter 3 lessons are called African American Civil Rights, and we're taking a look at how have people fought to gain their rights and what has the government done to protect people's rights. So we're looking at the events of the African American Civil Rights Movement in the 50s and 60s and taking a look at the different strategies from the leaders. Lesson 8 is the introduction into this civil rights movement, and we take a look at these 5 what-ifs. All of them have to do with race and laws. Let students know that it wasn't that long ago that these were in place. Review the strategies that women used to gain suffrage. Pass out the Fighting for Rights and Government Action worksheet, and then begin to review previous lessons about segregation. You can remind students about Plessy versus Ferguson and how this allowed the separate but equal schools to be developed, even though they weren't actually equal. Here's a comparison that students can take a look at. Remind students of the term segregation, and then watch the video about Alexander Clark, review important information about him and how he helped support the civil rights movement. In lesson 9, students will look at different visuals of events in the civil rights movement. Probably the best strategy for having students look at these visuals is to create stations around the room. You could also make a packet for each group and have them go through each one in small groups. Lesson 10, we're talking about school desegregation. Students take a look at Brown versus Board and consider what it did for African American civil rights. What this did was it took out part of the decision from Plessy versus Ferguson. We have the image of Ruby Bridges, and then here we have an image of a student trying to walk into high school in Little Rock. Take a look at the faces in the background. Here's the Little Rock 9 being escorted by the National Guard simply so they could go to school. And on slide 42, we have Governor George Wallace trying to block integration at the University of Alabama. Give students lots of time to learn about Ruby Bridges, Little Rock 9, and why former Governor Wallace is trying to block students from entering the college. That last picture is pretty interesting as it shows a lot about how state governments in some of the southern states did not want to follow the desegregation orders from the national government. In slide 43, there's a picture that looks very similar to what we've already seen of students trying to go to school and the hatred seen in the crowd. What's different about this image is that this took place in the North, not in the South. Lesson 11, students learn about the Montgomery bus boycotts and talk about the conditions of the buses and segregation rules. You can talk about Rosa Parks, spend a lot of time defining boycott, why it started, and whether or not it was successful. We also see Martin Luther King Jr. have a role in this, and you'll want to consider the responses of others. Remind students of the 4 strategies towards civil action and ask which ones the bus boycotts would be. In lesson 12, we learn about Edna Griffin and the Greensboro lunch sit-in. This is an Iowa connection as Edna Griffin was refused service at the lunch counter outside Katz's drugstore in downtown Des Moines, which sparked a protest. Talk about the 2 types of protesting, the nonviolent and the violent, and then focus in on the 3rd what if to start talking about the Greensboro lunch sit-in. Lesson 13, we learn about the Freedom Riders. Explain what civil disobedience means before watching the video. After watching the video, explain that the Freedom Rides are examples of nonviolent and peaceful protesting. Point out that people who went on the rides had training on how to stay peaceful if they were attacked. In lesson 14, we learn about the March on Washington and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There's a worksheet that corresponds with a video about the March on Washington, and there's a few key points to watch so that you're not watching the entire thing. Note that all sorts of people attended. Have students read March on Washington and take a look at JFK's address on civil rights before looking at the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Lesson 15, we're taking a look at the March of Montgomery to Selma, the 24th Amendment, and the Voting Rights Act of 1865. In this one, we review some of the barriers to voting, such as the literacy test and the poll tax. Have students look at this image of Dr. King and the other members of the march. Have students consider why people continued to march and complete these peaceful protests when others responded with violence. Then take a look at the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This enforced the 15th Amendment, which meant that African Americans are allowed to vote with no restrictions based on these literacy tests and poll taxes. Lesson 16, we get into a fair housing conversation, and students take a look at this image to try and figure out what is being protested at this point. Now that we've had the Voting Acts in 1965, we have something else we need to fix. This leads into a conversation about discrimination in housing, of how a lot of times African Americans could not get loans to live somewhere else, and that the neighborhoods and houses that they were usually able to afford had higher crime, were in areas with usually fewer resources, and had lower quality public accommodations. Chapter 4 is entitled Civil Rights Today, and we're taking a look at what other groups have fought for civil rights and whether or not people still have to fight for their rights. Lesson 17 spends time considering Native American rights, thinking back to white settlers coming into the area, and eventually the U.S. government creating reservations and forcing Native Americans off their lands. Native Americans living on these reservations, even though they were forced there by the government, were not treated as American citizens. The Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 helped change that, but it was the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968 that granted citizenship rights to Native Americans. Lesson 18, we take a look at Latin American rights. There's a text, Separate is Never Equal, Sylvia Mendez and her family's fight for desegregation. There's quite a few lesson ideas available. Then explain the case that was held for school desegregation for Mexican Americans. Ask students to figure out if this happened before or after the Brown versus Board decision. Have students take a look at this image of the United Farm Workers March. Explore the Latin American rights movement in the 1960s with any of the resources listed. Be sure to talk about Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. Lesson 19 is a lesson about Americans with disabilities. Ask students to think about examples of accessibility that they've seen in their communities and explain that this disabilities rights movement helped ensure that public places are accessible for all people. The summative assessment for this unit is a Civil Rights Leaders Research Project. Students are going to answer the compelling question, is it important to protect our rights? Have at least 2 supporting questions to help them answer the compelling question. So they pick 2 of the 4 and answer those to help answer the overall question. Students need to use multiple resources and determine their credibility. And there's a large variety of topic suggestions, including civil rights leaders from women's rights, civil rights, and African American civil rights. I hope that this video is a helpful resource as you prepare to teach the Civil Rights Unit. As always, please reach out to your PLC leader, instructional coach, or curriculum facilitator with any questions or if you're in need of any additional support.